إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله فإن الله تعالى مع المتقين وبعد. The Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, he said, أعدى عدوك نفسك التي بين جنبيك. The Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, he said that the worst of enemies, the worst of opposition that you will find in this life is the nafs, yourself, which is in between your two sides. And this enemy, i.e. the nafs, the self, works with shaitan. In fact, the nafs is the door through which shaitan has access to us. Shaitan is only as strong as our desires are in dictating and determining the actions that we take. And so by subduing and overcoming the nafs, the self, we are able to subdue and overcome shaitan. And Allah Azza wa Jal has given us a month wherein which we can practice subduing the self. A month wherein we learn how to suppress our base desires. The month of Ramadan. And many of us, we overlook this concept. The concept of mujahadatun nafs, struggling and striving against the self. But this is what the month of Ramadan is. The month of Ramadan, it is a month wherein we struggle and we strive and we fight against ourselves, in the hope that we are able to take that which we acquire in Ramadan, i.e. the ability to say no to the self, outside of the month of Ramadan and apply it throughout the rest of the year. And when we look to the ayah, although perhaps an ayah which we recite all the time and has been mentioned from the minbar many times, again, we sometimes overlook the concept contained. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. Allah instructs us in this verse on the outcome that we should try to attain from Ramadan. And it's very important for us to understand 2 points here. The point that we're going to reflect over, i.e. at-taqwa and the acquirement of taqwa and what that actually means and entails. And the second point, a secondary point, but a point which is just as important, but not in this particular khutbah, is that we are a purpose-driven creature. If we do not have purpose, we fall victim to our whims and our desires, and we fall victim to the wind, like a leaf, flowing and swaying whichever way our whims and our desires determine. Purpose is very important for mankind, and purpose is very important for men. And perhaps one of the reasons for the increase in depression amongst men today is a lack of purpose. we as mankind and men in particular, we have forgotten our purpose. And therefore it's easy to fall into depression, which we see happening amongst many young men today. But back to the point, inshaAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us that Ramadan has been prescribed upon us, fasting has been prescribed upon us, just as it was prescribed upon those who came before us, the nations who preceded us from the believing nations. Likewise, they would fast. Why? لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you can acquire taqwa. And in Ramadan, what is it that we're doing? We are for not 24 hours, but 12 hours on average, perhaps more in the summer and spring, etc. We are saying no to the self. You want to eat? No. You want to drink? No. You want a stimulant, tea, coffee, whatever else it might be? No. You want to engage in intimacy with the spouse? No. You're saying no to yourself. And so you are conditioning yourself to become a person who follows the instruction of Allah Azza wa Jal over the whims and the desires of the self. And that's what taqwa is. That's what taqwa is. Taqwa is to put Allah before the nafs, to put Allah before desire, to put Allah before dunya. And that's what we do. And likewise, those that are struggling with haram outside of the month of Ramadan, within the month of Ramadan, they give up the haram. And they prove to themselves that they can do it. Those who don't pray in Ramadan, they're praying. Those who don't read the Quran in Ramadan, they're reading the Quran. Why? Because we create the environment of piety mentally and spiritually, which aids us in the pursuit of taqwa in that particular month. And if we go back to the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, أَعْدَى عَدُوِكَ نَفْسُكَ الَّتِي بَيْنَ جَنْبَيْكَ, your worst enemy is your very self. That's it. Your very self. If you can struggle and strive and contain and suppress yourself, then no man can stand in front of you, nor no devil. And so the struggle of this life is a struggle against the self. And there are many rounds to this fight. And one of the most important approaches that we can have is, if we lose the round, don't lose the fight. Get back up and continue to struggle and strive against the self. And there are two prophets that perhaps encapsulate amongst the rest of the prophets, but two in particular, Allah Azza wa Jal mentions them, and we are very aware of them, but maybe not from the concept of sacrifice. Ibrahim alayhi salam and the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. And both are referred to as Khalilullah. Ibrahim, Khalilullah, his life was sacrifice. وَإِذِ ابْتَلَىٰ إِبْرَاهِيمَ رَبُّهُ بِكَلِمَاتٍ فَأَتَمَّهُنْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us that Allah tested Ibrahim بِكَلِمَات. And some of the ulama, they say kalimat, instructions of what to do, what to give up, what to stay away from, etc. فَأَتَمَّهُنْ. And He completed them. He carried them out. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, He's going to make him what? Imama. Because of the struggle and sacrifice Ibrahim faced against himself before anyone else, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him an imam. And you look, Ibrahim, he went against his father. And a son naturally wants the love and the accommodation and the value of his father's opinion. But he gave it up. Why? For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. He potentially put himself in a position where he was going to give up his life. When he stood in the courtyard of Nimrud and he debated with him, a powerful king at the time. He gave up his son, Ismail. He assumed he was going to sacrifice him. And of course Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaced him, but he assumed and he was willing, and he put the knife to his neck for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal. And likewise, the same son, he took him to the barren land of Mecca and left him with his mother, with no water in sight, no food in sight. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructed him to do so. And the love that a father has for a child, for his son, especially Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was waiting for a son for years, but he was willing to give it up. Likewise, the Prophet ﷺ, we don't need to look at what he lost and was out of his control, but what he gave up, his status in Mecca, his family ties in Mecca, his position. He could have become one of the leaders of Quraysh. His land and everything that he knew in his land, he gave it up. All for what? For the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal. Sacrifice. And the reality is, without sacrifice, there can be no taqwa. Without sacrifice, there can be no taqwa. And so if we want to become people of taqwa, if we want to become righteous people, then we have to struggle and strive against the self before anything else. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله وحده وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء ومن تبعه وبعد. And likewise, if we go to the pages of history and we read through the books of history, those who have been granted success in the deen after the Prophet ﷺ, they all followed the blueprint of sacrifice. The ulama, they sacrificed their time. They sacrificed their intellectual capacity. The mujahideen and the abtal, they sacrificed their strength, their lives, their wealth. Sacrifice is the core element when it comes to success. Likewise, when we look to the people of the dunya, those that run after dunya, and those whose only concern is building a life in this temporary abode, in order to acquire anything in this life, you have to sacrifice. Without sacrifice, you cannot achieve. And so sacrifice should be a word which is inscribed in between our two eyes. And when the desire is calling, when temptation is alive within us, we remind ourselves, sacrifice for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal in order to acquire a position with Him. And with the month of Ramadan, we don't only want to think about Ramadan as a month in isolation. And planning starts now. I want to look at Ramadan, and it has been mentioned for the last few years. But alhamdulillah, we have another opportunity. I look at Ramadan and I ask myself, who do I want to be when I leave the month of Ramadan? Not how do I want to spend the month of Ramadan. Who do I want to be when the month of Ramadan ends? And then I use that month to build myself into that person. If currently I'm struggling to pray 5 times a day, my focus should be what? The 5 times prayers. If I'm struggling with a particular haram, in Ramadan I want to give it up, not for the month alone, but I want to give it up full stop. If I'm praying 5 times a day, but I'm struggling with the sunnah prayers in the month of Ramadan, I want to add the sunnah prayers into my daily routine. And so the month of Ramadan, I use it in accordance to my situation. Not every situation is the same. There is no point in a person coming to Taraweeh and they're not praying the 5 daily prayers. There is no point in a person giving up food and drink, but they're backbiting and slandering and so on and so forth. And so I have to take these months, these weeks that are coming in preparation for the month of Ramadan, write down, what do I need to change? What do I need to remove from my life? What do I need to add to my life? And then in the month of Ramadan, I apply that approach. And in order to understand who I want to be outside of the month of Ramadan, when Eid comes, who do I want to be? I have to ask myself, who do I want to be when death comes to me? When death comes to me, who do I want to be? Who do I want to be when I'm standing in front of Allah Azza wa Jal? Do I want to be a person who prays the nights and fasts weekly? Do I want to be a person who is reading the Quran every single day? Do I want to be a person who's praying his salawat on time, in jama'ah, in the masjid, and his rawatib? Do I want to be a person of sadaqah? If I want to be that person, I have to live like that person. And I have to ask myself, how far away am I from that person that I want to be now, and how do I get there? And I start to put steps in place. Okay, I'm struggling with my prayers, but I want to be that person. I'm going to put steps in place and I work towards it. And if we take that approach to life, we're living life as we should, in preparation for what? For our death. In preparation for our meeting with Allah Azza wa Jal. That's the purpose of life. And so I use the month of Ramadan to start my journey towards the person I want to be when I meet Allah Azza wa Jal. And for every single one of us, there are changes that we can make. For every single one of us, there are changes that we can make. And there are additions that we can add. But it takes strategy, time, and we have to plan so that we can best utilize the month. And in relation to the concept of taqwa and the concept of sacrifice, one of the great Shafi'i scholars of the past, he puts into poetry, he said, فَكُنْ مِنَ الْإِيمَانِ فِي مَزِيدِ وَفِي صَفَاءِ الْقَلْبِ ذَا تَجْدِيدِ بِكَثْرَةِ الصَّلَاةِ وَالطَّاعَاتِ وَتَرْكِ مَا لِلنَّفْسِ مِنْ شَهْوَاتِ. He said, be a person who is increasing his iman and purifying his heart. How so? By increasing in your acts of worship and your prayer, and leaving off that which you desire. And then he goes on to say, فَشَهْوَةُ النَّفْسِ مَعَ الذُّنُوبِ مُوجِبَتَانِ قَسْوَةَ الْقُلُوبِ. Because the following of desire partnered with sin leads to the hardening of the heart. And then he says, وَإِنَّ أَبْعَدَ قُلُوبِ النَّاسِ مِنْ رَبِّنَا الرَّحِيمِ قَلْبٌ قَاسِي. And the farthest heart away from Allah Azza wa Jal, Ar-Rahim, the most merciful, is the heart which is hardened. And in order to prevent the hardening of the heart, I have to what? Sacrifice my desires and my time in order to worship Allah Azza wa Jal. And when we apply those two to Ramadan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the conditions that allow for us to achieve such a position. We leave off sin. We say no to the self. We exert in our effort in praying, in sadaqah, in reading the Quran, and how do we feel? We feel great. And so we want to live our lives as we live our lives in Ramadan. And as has been said many times, we want to fast from the dunya just as we fast in the month of Ramadan from food and drink. Look at the dunya as the food and drink that we're not allowed during Ramadan. And sometimes it might be halal, but fasting and abstaining from it is better to earn ourselves a place in the akhirah. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد وارض اللهم عن أبي بكر وعن عمر وعن عثمان وعن علي وعن سائر الصحابة أجمعين اللهم تب علينا واعف عنا إنك أنت العفو الكريم اللهم بلغنا رمضان يا رب العالمين واجعلنا من الصائمين القائمين فيه اللهم يا رب العالمين يا مجيب الدعوات انصر إخواننا في فلسطين وفي أنحاء العالم يا رب العالمين وارفع راية الإسلام واجعلنا من الرافعين له وأقم الصلاة.